Thank you. This issue about how physicians think is a tricky one. It's something that you would think we have tackled before, and the sad history of medicine is that we haven't taken a close look at the ways in which we make decisions. We kind of extol the virtue of leaders like Osler and others who pronounce these deep insights into this complicated process. But in terms of a formal approach to coaching physicians on how to think, we really haven't done that very well at all. Just the last couple of years, things have improved. So what I'm going to focus on sounds a bit banal. It's just, I just want to talk about decision-making, the process of decision-making, because it seems to be what drives the whole of human existence. Disclaimer, I've got no conflicts of interest that I'm aware of. In fact, I'm the guy at Dell that gives the talk on how to avoid conflicts of interest. I just want to start with a short vignette. This is a true case that happened at Halifax. 12-year-old girl with a history of asthma, complained of shortness of breath and chest pain shortly after beginning a basketball game. Used her inhalers, no real change. Ambulance called. She was given albuterol by face mask, immediately taken to the nearest pediatric emergency department, which fortunately was just a couple of blocks away. However, on arrival there, she deteriorated further, stopped breathing, and had a cardiac arrest. And I've talked to, I wasn't there, but talked to some of the people who are involved in the code. And they were, at the outset, as you can imagine, very optimistic. Here's a basketball player, healthy girl, no period of anoxia, arrested in front of us, successfully intubated. And then they proceeded to apply the usual algorithms. For anybody who knows it, the pediatric hospital in Halifax is a very intense place. The nurses are all seem to me to be highly motivated. They take ACLS updates about every 10 minutes. But they are a very keen lot, and they certainly know their stuff. And however, despite running the codes for an hour, they had no luck and could not revive her. I'm going to come back to that because there's a few lessons in there. So, biggest lesson is really about decision-making. And if you haven't seen it, this paper is kind of interesting. It's so low profile, it just comes to the surface in this obscure journal called Operations Research that I've never seen before. And by a guy from a Duke at North Carolina. I was down there recently, lovely place, and heard about this guy. And he actually makes the case that decision-making is the leading cause for our death. And this sounds a bit odd, but when you think that typically what we do when we blame things for people dying, we say things like, yeah, well, she was a cigarette smoker, or she was morbidly obese, or she used too much alcohol, or he did this, or what we don't say that might be a little bit more helpful is that they made the wrong decisions. And in fact, there's a pediatric course in Halifax, a pediatric program in Halifax called Choices. And I've always admired that term because they're really talking about the choices that young people make, how to live their lives. And these are personal decisions. And the frightening statistic emerges from this clever overview that this guy has done, is that in the age range 15 to 64, 50 years of your best life usually, 55% of all deaths were attributed to personal decisions. It's a different way of looking at it, but it's an important way of framing it. And I'm not for 1 minute minimizing all the sociological, cultural, and other phenomena that are built into this. But he actually goes through and picks off the 11 top causes of death in the US in the year 2000 and puts in the preventability percent for each disease. And you can see for things like suicide, of course, it's 100% preventable. But for all the other diseases in there, it's fairly high. And it's an important way, I think, of framing the issue. He's not alone, we're not alone in thinking about this. A number of organizations in recent years, you didn't hear this stuff talked about that much 10 years ago. Over the last decade, it has emerged that, for example, the World Bank has published a paper recently confessing to the cognitive errors that they have made over the years in the attribution of funding and support to third world countries and so on, which have dramatic effects on individuals' life. But they just came out and said it. We've been operating for a number of years under these false premises, which are essentially thinking failures, which inevitably are cognitive biases. The US Intelligence Agency, very interested in this, put $60 million about 5 years ago into finding effective ways of debiasing people from cognitive biases. That was all. They just said, here's some common biases, develop a program that would minimize the impact of these biases on personal behavior, not medicine, not anything else, but how do we stop people but being victim to these biases that are out there. The US National Research Council has admitted that an awful lot of the research that they've been published and has been funded has been vulnerable. NASA recently contacted the Society for Improvement of Diagnosis in Medicine, which is in the States, but is now an international concern. I'm a member. And we were asked to develop a program for astronauts on deep space missions where they would be making decisions under tough conditions, right? Sleep deprivation, change of diet, change of everything. And how do you optimize the decisions that people make under those circumstances? Business management. Been studies on this published in the Harvard Review, in the Wall Street Journal, the judicial system. There's a great paper that I'll try and cover before we finish, just showing how much judges are impacted, can be impacted by biases in their decision-making. Great paper, if you ever see it, called Blinking on the Bench. And it was shortly after Malcolm Gladwell published his book, Blink, which, of course, was extolling the virtues of intuition in decision-making. That's where the interest was from the public. Unfortunately, it's not necessarily the best approach to take, as I hope to demonstrate. All disciplines of medicine now have published clinical papers demonstrating the effects of bias in critical decisions, often fatal, that have proved fatal. And I've just been collecting them over the years and thought, there's only one left here that hasn't really joined in, that was orthopedics, and they did about a year ago, finally, orthopedics talked about the impact of cognitive biases. Dentistry. The dentists occasionally ask me to go and talk to them, and I think, you know, they're only working in a small area like that, and how do you need me to... But when you get into their work and the decisions that they make, it's clear that they seem vulnerable. In every endeavor, every human endeavor, these biases operate. Veterinary medicine too. In fact, they've been very interested. We run a course on teaching and assessing critical thinking, TACT. We run it 2 or 3 times a year at Dell. You can take it online in the comfort of your own home. And we get people from all kinds of backgrounds. And veterinary medicine, funnily enough, these people are very conscientious about being aware of cognitive biases. As far as decision-making in medicine goes, this is a telling comment by Dave Eddy. And even though Sackett's group at McMaster gets credited with the evidence-based medicine approach, David Eddy was way ahead of everybody on this in stressing the importance of evidence in decision-making. And he talks about how you know, there was this vague process. When I went through medicine, and I think probably most people in this room, when you went through medicine, you did not have explicit teaching in decision making. I just don't think it happened. We would do other things. We would try and copy people who were good decision makers. But there were no explicit courses that I was aware of. That has changed. In the UK, there's an organization called CREAME, C-R-E-M-E, is the acronym, Clinical Reasoning in Medical Education. Actually, they make the I and E. You prefer it. CREAME sounds better than crime. So 12 medical schools in the UK now working on this project. Dalhousie's working on it. I get contacts from all over the world, from people in Pittsburgh, from people in the Carolinas and so on, in California. There's a lot of people working on this now. What is the most effective way to train doctors how to think? And is there a critical period for it? Is it too late once they've been through medical school? And so on. I don't think it is, by the way. But Eddie's conclusion was that medical decision-making as a field worthy of study did not exist. He's talking about the 70s, but I would argue when he wrote this paper in 2005, not much had changed. Really, I've only seen change in the last 10 years. And that's another story. There's lots of reasons why that's happened, but a big one has been that the stuff that we use to talk about decision-making now does not originate from medicine. It originates from cognitive science. So we're trying to follow the work of the cognitive scientists, and it's tough stuff to read. I see myself as a kind of translator. You know, can you bring in a translator, please? And try to interpret what these guys are doing, which is critical to what we're doing. But very few people in medicine actually have any expertise in cognitive psychology, which is where these ideas are coming from now and are being validated. Diagnosis for us is the canary in the coal mine as far as decision-making goes. If diagnosis is bad, then there's something wrong with clinical decision-making, unless you're working in some bizarre system. But we'll see that that's not the case. This frightening statistic was put together about a decade ago by 3 luminaries in the patient safety movement, Lucian Leap, Don Berwick, and David Bates. 3 top guys, and they looked at the estimated number of preventable hospital deaths due to diagnostic failure in the US each year. So these are people who are already in hospital, usually with a diagnosis, usually need some kind of diagnosis to get in the place. And these are people who've died as a result of some sort of failure in the diagnostic process during their admission. 40,000 to 80,000. And from the people who work in this area, the upper limit of that range is probably more correct than the lower limit, almost certainly. In Canada, this would translate into 4,000 to 8,000 deaths annually. And this is a kind of secret killer. It's a silent killer, and it's not one that gets a lot of attention. If you talk to lawyers and you talk to physicians about what's your worst case scenario or what's the worst thing that's happened to you, it's usually a diagnostic failure. But sadly, Canadian Patient Safety Institute has not grabbed this. It needs a lot of publicity and it needs a lot of work. And you know, maybe there are some aspects of the Canadian healthcare system that might help us in this better than in other places. This is a study from emergency medicine. The emergency department, if you haven't heard this expression before, is considered to be a laboratory of human error. I mean, the conditions that prevail there, you're pushed, you're interrupted, you're fatigued, you're sleep deprived, you're food deprived. Anybody who's worked in the emergency knows. I mean, that's not how we live every hour of every day, but those are common prevailing conditions. And they looked at the factors that contributed to diagnostic error. There's a lot of them. But the bottom line, the message to take away is cognitive factors were involved 96% of the time. Most people who work in the area say it's 100%. At the end of the day, the physician or the person who's making the diagnostic decision, which these days could be a nurse practitioner or could be, especially if you're in the States now, a physician's assistant. I don't know whether they're allowed anywhere in Canada. I don't think so yet. We certainly don't have them in Nova Scotia. But these people are the final vector for the decision-making that goes into diagnosis, and it's a critical role. And I don't see, sometimes, when I've looked for it, I haven't seen an acknowledgement from those kind of paramedical disciplines, including paramedics, haven't seen an acknowledgement of the importance of decision-making. The big push, as it is in medicine, is knowledge. You have to know more and more. The more you know, the better, which up to a point is correct. But of course, being knowledgeable does not guarantee being able to make good decisions. If you look at the alleged medical error data this is from the Physician Insurers Association of America, PIAA, which is a collaborative of insurers associations. Over a 25-year period, diagnostic errors were number one, and close to 30% as the prime allegation in the medical legal action. Improper performance, failure to supervise or monitor, failure to recognize the complication of treatment. A number of those things are diagnostic related too. In Canada, it looks like this. This is CMPA data from over a 5-year period, from 2005 to the end of 2009, and they categorized their legal cases into these 6 groups: performance of a procedure, communication, diagnosis, administrative issues, medication errors, and conduct disorders. And you can see we're a pretty well-behaved lot. But diagnosis is number one, not just number one. It's more than all the others combined. And if you end up in a medico-legal action, the chances are it's going to be diagnosis-related. So the rationale is this. Our barometer for failed clinical reasoning is diagnostic failure. That's the main thing we focus on. I think that's reasonable. The current estimates of diagnostic failure across the board are about 10 to 15%. Family medicine, internal medicine, emergency medicine, all around 15% at least. If you're in the visual specialties, radiology, anatomic pathology, dermatology, you're down around 1 to 2%. But where there is greater uncertainty, there is a greater failure rate, not surprisingly. I think it's unacceptable. I have talked to some people about this, and they say, well, you know, it's a complicated business, and sure, we're going to get it wrong some of the time. But is 10 to 15% okay? I don't think so. In my department, and the problem is, we're not measuring it. In my department this year, I sort of quietly have observed 3 deaths due to diagnostic failure. And only one of them made it to M&M. And even then, when it got to M&M, it was more a presentation of the challenges of this particular disorder, which was aortic dissection. There are a lot of challenges associated with diagnosing it, but the whole M&M was focused on the problem of dissection. This lady actually managed to turn up twice with a thoracic aortic dissection, which got missed both times, and then the third time she came in, she was dying. And again, the physicians involved couldn't get outside of the medical challenge. What are the medical features of thoracic dissection? That's what I mostly heard at the rounds. I didn't hear anybody saying, until I said it, but I was supposed to say it, that's why I got invited, I think. But nobody was saying, hang on guys, we all know about aortic dissection. What happened here was nobody thought of it. Why wouldn't you think of it? It's like pulmonary embolus. Pulmonary embolus, most people know the pathophysiology of pulmonary embolus in excruciating detail. How often does it get missed on first presentation? About 50% of the time, 50%. But it's not because we have a knowledge deficit. That's not the reason. We don't have a knowledge deficit about thoracic aortic dissection, although the presentation of the case brought out a few features that were helpful to remind people of all the funny things that can happen with that. But at the end of the day, people were not saying, how come we missed something? And there were some very interesting features once you got into the case. As the dissection progressed over 48 hours, the patient's story changed. And the patient was getting labeled as somebody who was an unreliable historian. You know, one of the nurses was saying, yeah, well, her story kept changing. I mean, it was unreliable. And so you got atypical this and unreliable historian, and throw a few more things into there, and it gets misdiagnosed, fatally in that case. And then there were two other cases, but only one of them. And this is just what I'm aware of, and I don't keep a record of everything that happens. It's just people are aware of my interest and say, did you hear about that sort of thing? But if it's like that in my department, which is fairly small, then you can imagine that the figure that's put up for Canada, 4,000 to 8,000 a year, probably not too far off. So the way that people see it generally is that the system, the healthcare system, is responsible about 25% of the time and the individual about 75% of the time. But as I say, most people believe that the individual is actually responsible maybe closer to 100%. The major source of failure is how the individual thinks, not what they know. And we give talks on this throughout medical school, especially towards the end of clerkship. We start hammering this into people. And from the beginning, they're not that interested because this is kind of fluffy. It's woolly. It's not real medicine, talking about how the doctor thinks. And they're more interested in what's going to get them through the exam. And the exam doesn't really challenge their thinking. The exam challenges their knowledge, which most people in Canada do really well. The success rate on those exams is very good. The main factor that determines thinking competency is this concept of rationality, which is the new emphasis that exists now in cognitive science. Cognitive scientists don't talk much about, in decision making, don't talk so much about intelligence or motivation or effort or anything. They talk a lot about rationality. Rationality is the sort of currency of thinking. And we need to know what influences it. We need to recognize that the cognitive scientists are our best source of help. If you read stuff that comes from the medical literature in this area, it's often not that helpful, except to reinforce something you may have already accepted. So this is the main theory of how all humans make decisions. And you've probably seen some of this before. I know some of you have. But there are two systems that people talk about. The intuitive system, which was referred to as System 1, it's extremely fast, it's unconscious, it's kind of reflexive thinking, it's autonomous thinking, doesn't involve any deliberation, usually involves some kind of pattern recognition, highly dependent on context, and is qualitative. You know, it can vary in terms of the strength of your conviction and also the power of the presentation to you. The second main area is called the rational system, or System 2, or the analytical system. This is what we tend, if you did a poll on what people think decision-making is, they would say, well, you know, we generate hypotheses, we test them, we reject some, we accept others, we rule them in, we do tests to confirm, and so on. And that's mostly goes on in the rational system, and this is not where we spend our time. About 95% of our time is spent in the intuitive system. So we need to know more about intuition. We need to know when we should be getting into the rational system. In contrast to intuition, it is slow. In contrast, you can make fast decisions in the rational system, especially if the disease is highly pathognomonic. But it's slow, typically, it's deliberate, it's objective, it follows the rules of science, it's independent of context, independent of mood, independent of ambient conditions, and it's quantitative. You can measure it. So these two systems are really in high contrast with each other. And in an effort to convince medical students to get their attention on this, we resort to some cartoonish strategies. On the left, you have a famous figure. You can actually substitute him with other famous figures lately. I better be careful. I was down in the States 2 days ago in Chicago and made that joke, and I was worried about getting my plane out. Okay. It's fast, automatic, emotional, impulsive, follows basic drives, habits, and beliefs, and occasionally tweets at 4 o'clock in the morning. So, System 1. System 2 is this sort of hybrid from Vulcan, human Vulcan hybrid. And this is characterized as being slower, deliberate, methodical, effortful, logical, has reflection in it, planning and problem solving. And a colleague of mine, Sam Campbell, is also an emergency physician, puts it this way in his talk. He says, System 1 is kind of automatic and streamlined. And if you really want to get from A to B in the fastest way possible on a bike, your best bet is this sort of carbo-craft, highly engineered, lightweight machine where you go into a particular position, put your head down and pedal like crazy. That is System 1. It's the best way to get from A to B, and you will be successful unless there are some obstacles along the way or some other uncertainty is built into it, but it's usually for going from A to B. In contrast, if you're doing this, you need a properly designed mountain bike. Your behavior needs to be different. You need to be monitoring every decision that you made, literally for every inch of the way. And so you need two different systems depending on where you are. But again, you cannot make that an exclusive caveat. Because sometimes when you think you're in safe territory on a straight line from A to B, you can be seriously wrong. You know, not that long ago, I had a patient come into emergency with constipation was the presenting complaint. And the triage nurse wrote down constipation, and the nurse receiving picked up on it, came to me and sort of delivered this monologue towards the end of a very tired shift, you know, saying, you know, what are people like this doing, coming to emergency, you know, seeing us for these, should be going to the family doctor, actually should just go to a pharmacist or something like, all those kind of attributional comments, and reasonable, you know, who's going to argue with that? Turns out the guy had cauda equina syndrome, and it was a long and complicated journey on the mountain bike to get to that. But he came very close to being dismissed for turning up at emergency with a trivial complaint. We like intuitions in healthcare, in our practice, in our clinical practice. They're fast, they're extremely compelling. If you arrive at an intuition by yourself, it evolves in your experience so that you start to get a feel for how something's working. That becomes very compelling to you and difficult to change. And there are some interesting theories about this. They talk about children trying to understand the external world as they're growing up. Children are engaged with the real world to a far greater extent than we think. And they're already beginning to form ideas of how intuitive physics works and all those things. The problem is, without the knowledge and the understanding of the world at the beginning, they start to form these kind of crude intuitions about how the world works. And then once they get established and the child comes to believe them, they have to be overturned. And overturning something is a lot more work than just going straight there in the first place. And in fact, they did some studies on it. It got to children. They know what milestones children exhibit at different stages, and a bit like Piaget did in his work, try to get them before they reach the milestone and see if they can influence it in some ways. And sometimes if you give children hard facts about how the world works, They don't get these intuitions that later lead them into trouble. They require minimal cognitive effort. Almost no work is involved. This is an autonomous system. Autonomous means that your brain doesn't even consult you about the decision it makes. You know, if you see, I'll show you in a minute, a famous rash, your brain will go ahead and do the work for you because of all the work you've done already in the past, but your brain doesn't even consult you. It just generates the response. So that's the autonomous nature of System 1. They are addictive. Once people grab them, they can't let go of them very easily. They mostly serve us well. They are occasionally wrong, and they are sometimes catastrophically wrong and lead to bad outcomes. So a lot of intuition depends on this pattern recognition requirement that our brain has got. All animals in the animal kingdom depend upon pattern recognition. You know, well, I was going to go into bird watching, which my wife is very keen on, and drags me into it sometimes too. And it's very interesting to see how birds behave. And often, you know, their responses are kind of clever, but most of the time, if not all of the time, they are responding to particular patterns. And so do we. And most of that goes on in System 1 up here. This is the model we have for dual system in medicine. We published this in academic medicine about 10 years ago now. Patient presents, left-hand side. Your brain, the pattern processing part of your brain, which all mammal brains have, either recognizes it or it doesn't. If it recognizes it, you go into System 1 and very fast through to a diagnosis. If it doesn't recognize it, you have to go into System 2 because you then have to be analytical, saying, hang on, what's going on here? I don't understand this. I'll give you an example of this in a minute. So then you go into System 2, which is slow, deliberate, and so on. If you keep going into System 2, you eventually end up in System 1. Think of learning to drive a car. When you first get in a car, it's a bewildering challenge. All these pedals, wheels, switches, and everything to guide a ton or more of metal down the road in a safe fashion. But after you've been coached there for 40 or 50 hours, you can do it reasonably safely and not kill anybody. The other features of the model is that System 2, your analytical system, can override System 1. This is the red channel, which is probably the most important bit of our behavior in everything. T is for toggle, which means you can move backwards and forwards between the two systems. This channel here is irrational override, which is, despite your brain knowing what the best thing to do is in System 2, it's still overridden by System 1. That's the power of intuition. And then the other rule is that the whole system tends to resort to System 1 whenever it gets the chance. That's called the cognitive miser function. These are all terms from cognitive science. So to be a cognitive miser is not somebody who's kind of covetous of their thinking, which I'm not going to share with anybody, but it is really your brain taking shortcuts and wanting to repeat the status quo rather than make the cognitive effort to change and really do some work to think things through differently. So it's a predictor of the preservation of the status quo once it gets established. So everybody in the room's got that diagnosis already. I don't hesitate. Even some of our legal friends probably have that diagnosis. When you first see it, though, you're in System 2. When you're a medical student, you say, well, you know, patches of redness, clusters of vesicles, seems to follow one or two dermatomes, stops at the midline. That is an analytical interpretation. But after you've seen that several times, you make the System 1 interpretation, which is just like that. And it's been timed. Takes you 300 milliseconds, 1/3 of a second, to make a fairly complicated diagnosis about a virus that is dormant for a lot of the time, and then lives up near the cord and comes down, et cetera, et cetera. All that you can do in 300 milliseconds. So intuition is a powerful thing, especially for highly pathognomonic visual presentations. But if your presentation is weak and dizzy little old man coming into emergency, It's not like that at all. The differential is this wide, and it's going to take you a while to start to cone down on what's really going on. So, for example, this is a pattern. When I first saw this, I thought, well, it could be a Rorschach test, could be map of the Philippines, could be anything. But in the course of my life, you get trained in the kind of basic anatomy and pathology and physiology of these other things going on, and you come to recognize, perhaps, there we go. I lost it. But once you see it, there it is. Once you see it, you can't see anything else. Once your intuition has discovered that pattern, then it's very hard now to say, well, hang on a minute. Yes, somebody said that looks like a cow head, but in fact, I think we can be more persuaded that that looks like the Malaysian peninsula there and so on. You can't kind of undo the percept. It's with you. You've got it, and it's very compelling. So how much time do we spend respectively in these two systems? Well, I think I already mentioned that we're in System 1. System 2 is the bit above the surface here. System 1, our intuitive system, is this huge mass below the surface. So what about the 5% of the time we spend in the rational mode? This guy here, Stanovich, is a Canadian. He's in Toronto, Keith Stanovich. He is the leader right now of the cognitive science groups that I follow. And I think their work is just sterling. Stanovich, Toplak, and West, three of them. One of them's American. And they are just steaming down the road on this. They've developed something called CART, C-A-R-T, which is the Comprehensive Assessment of Rational Thinking. And this presently, if you were admitting people to medical school and you said, look, what kind of people do you want? I would probably say, send me the people who have got the best thinking skills, because we can train all of them in the knowledge acquisition. We know we can do that, but we can't always train them to be good thinkers. So how would you do an assessment of somebody's rational thinking? Take the CART, which is now referred to as an RQ test, rationality quotient, instead of IQ, intelligence quotient. Take the CART and give me this guy's rational score here. And then if I have to choose 100 people from 5,000 people, I can choose the best decision makers. And I really think that is worth considering. But presently, the CART takes 6 hours to complete, although I think it's a small investment of time for what you get out of it. But the important thing really is that we now know an awful lot of what would contribute to a high RQ score, your rationality quotient. And here's the kind of things that the cognitive psychologists have characterized as signifying good rational behavior, people who collect enough information. And this is embraced in the cognitive bias referred to as the unpacking principle. Are you willing to unpack enough information that you're in a strong position to make a good decision? And surprisingly, people often don't do that. They take shortcuts. They take dangerous shortcuts. Seek different points of view before coming to a conclusion. Try to think out loud. Try to engage other members of the team. Try to engage other colleagues. When I came into medicine from psychology, I thought it was really odd the way that medical people tended to work by themselves, and you didn't know what they were doing. You're sitting next to somebody in the emergency department, and he could have just come from a cardiac arrest, and you wouldn't know. But people don't share their thinking, and I would argue that it's a good strategy because as soon as you share your thinking, you improve it. There's some good evidence that happens. And part of that is just that as soon as you think out loud, you go into System 2, because System 2 is verbal. System 1, the intuitive system, is not verbal. So as soon as you start to talk out loud, and that's why people who have medical students or residents working with them tend to make fewer mistakes than when they're on their own, because verbalizing and structuring your thinking improves once you are thinking out loud, as it were. Think thoroughly. A lot of these are sort of sound like motherhood statements on rationality, but they're worth reinforcing. Calibrate the degree of strength of your opinion to the degree of evidence. You know, if you're going to make a guess, say, look, this is a guess, and I don't have evidence, but I got a feeling this might be going on. Think about consequences. Unanticipated consequences get us into a lot of trouble. Explicitly weight the pluses and minuses of situations before making a decision. Seek nuance and subtlety. I get uncomfortable with people who are categorical unless they make a categorical statement like, you know, we should stop persecuting whoever or something very obvious and acceptable. But it's okay being categorical about things that are rock solid core beliefs. But when people are categorical about transient shifting circumstances, then you should be worried. And especially if anybody's absolute. Well, it's always that way. What else did you think it was? You know, that sort of thing. That's dangerous stuff. Well, I say that because I've been wrong so often when I've thought that way. I want to just quickly go through rationality because this is the key message that I want to cover. Rationality for the cognitive scientist now, and this is a condensation of about 20 papers or so, so it is rounded off a bit at the edges. But rationality breaks down into these two problems. Your brain has processing problems, the way that it processes information, or it has content problems. That's a categorical statement. Now, if we take these separately, the biggest problem for processing in your brain, for the human brain, is this thing called cognitive miserliness. And as I said, that is the tendency to take shortcuts, to look at things superficially. These psychologists actually lay that out. Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner in decision-making, coined the term Wysiati, which is this right here. What you see is all there is. And some people go through life like that, just forming that initial superficial impression of what's happening and then having to live with it. Accepting things at face value, not dealing with things in sufficient breadth and depth, and avoiding complexity. And you see that. You see young newly graduated practitioners coming into medicine in where we are, and you see if a patient's complicated, they don't want to accept them into their practice. And if they show up and say, yeah, I've got diabetes, and I had a heart attack, and had one stroke, and you know, they start reeling off their various problems, then they say, well, you know, we may not be able to get you in, we're getting close to capacity now. There is a deliberate effort to avoid complexity sometimes that is quite worrying. But anyway, this whole arm here is referred to, psychologists have three major categories of where rationality goes wrong. This first one is called making hasty judgments, number one. And then for the other two, we need to know about this concept called mindware, which was developed by a psychologist, David Perkins at Harvard. And he just talks about, you know, we've all got brains, we've all got frontal lobes and cerebella and that sort of thing. We all have the hardware, but we all have different mindware. Mindware is the sort of software of the brain, and there's all kinds of studies about where your software comes from. But there's two problems with mindware, and then we're done with the theory. But I just got to get this across. The first problem with mindware is gaps in the mindware. So these are typically knowledge deficits, but they're not knowledge deficits like, I don't know why people have pulmonary emboli. They're deficits around biomedical, biostatistical phenomena like sensitivity, specificity, likelihood ratios, Bayesian reasoning, numbers needed to treat, and all those things. That sort of area, most people are weak in. Medical people don't like that numeracy problem. And we tend to be deficient there. And people with impaired sight, impaired probability thinking, being persuaded by one or two cases where you obviously need a decent N, ignoring alternate hypotheses in science, in the way that you're thinking scientifically. And the psychologists call this group distorted probability. People have a distorted probability about the environment. Gamblers have distorted probabilities about what's going to happen. I mean, you can tell them, the system's eventually designed to beat you. You will almost never come out on top. But there's something about people's perception of probability theory that they think if I buy a lottery ticket or I gamble deliberately, carefully, thoughtfully, that somehow I'm going to win. And then the other problem, so in mindware gaps, the people who are making the decisions are actually missing these critical, often biostatistical kinds of data. In mindware contamination, the person has what they think are the means to solve this particular problem, but it's contaminated and it's corrupted. And it typically involves cognitive biases. If you go to Wikipedia, check out cognitive biases, there's over 100 of them now. Cultural conditioning problems. The different biases exert themselves in different cultures. The West is different from the East. Studies have shown this. People engage in illogical reasoning. There's about 24 logical fallacies. And this is a true story. They had a group of school children who were about 12 years old, analyzed 3 minutes of Donald Trump's address somewhere, and found 12 logical fallacies in 3 minutes. And of course, egocentric thinking, where it's fun sometimes, but it's not science. And this category is referred to as, biased judgments. This third category. So those are the 3 big areas where we go wrong. Making hasty judgments, having distorted ideas of how the world works from a scientific point of view, and especially with regard to probability, and biased judgments based mainly on the impact of cognitive biases. And again, Stanovich's group says everything from investment fiascos to medical error has been linked to contaminated mindware, where people have a means to solve a problem. It's not missing in the sense of a gap. It's just what they've got is corrupted. Facing up to that is the first step towards better decisions. We need to understand more about biases. This is our rationalometer that we show medical students. And if the needle's pointing over here towards biases, your rationality is going the wrong way. You've got to be over in the green zone where you have fewer biases. Stanovich's group says biases are a direct measure of rationality pretty well. So how do we get to be better decision makers? Tell people to try harder. I don't think that works. Well, maybe it works. Our leader in our emergency department has a very soft approach to people. He just looks at you in a withering way if you've done something wrong, but rarely sort of flogs you in public. Most people we work with, we share our clinical environment with, are hardworking. I mean, that's one thing I think you can say about medicine. So trying harder, not necessarily going to work. Okay, the imperatives, and I'm going to wrap this up now. We need to raise awareness of decision making. This has gone on too long, this sort of head in the sand saying somehow or other, after we've trained you for 4 years and a further 5 years, we're going to actually make you a good decision maker by mimicry or copying or whatever else we want to call it. We have to give these people explicit goals and teach them explicit facts about decision making. And we know cognitive science has done an awful lot of good work in the last 10 years, 10 or 15 years, really major gains. I just don't think it was possible when I went through medical school. That we should know dual process theory. This is the dominant model of decision making. I think that's here to stay. I can't see anything coming along to replace it, especially now as it's not a model anymore. There is neuroanatomical, neurophysiological evidence to support we know where in the brain the two systems are. We know how they interact. There's some great work going on with functional magnetic resonance imaging showing the interactivity of these two systems and that they are fairly discrete and they operate differently. We need to promote reflective practice, metacognition, mindfulness. These are all terms for that red channel in the diagram, which is system 2 looking at system 1. If you're engaged in reflection, either in what you're doing at the time or later, you look back to reflect on what you've done, that's reflection, on action, in action, and on action, then you improve the quality of your thinking generally. Metacognition is just thinking about thinking. Mindfulness is actually a tuned awareness of the moment. You know, this is essentially a Buddhist principle, but people have written about this in the context of patient safety and say, being mindful, great paper published in JAMA by Sibinga and Wu, Erica Sibinga, S-I-B-I-N-G-A, and Albert Wu. Albert Wu you've probably heard of in patient safety. But they talked about the principles of mindfulness and how it helps people to detect cognitive biases and allows you the opportunity. You've got to detect them before you can fix them. We need to teach what the main biases are. You don't need to know all 100, but on the critical thinking website, we talk about maybe 50. And if you know 12, the top 12, you're probably doing well. Teach the main logical fallacies. There's about 24 of them. And it's priceless sometimes just to hear politicians going on, especially around election time, and just picking off the different fallacies, you know, and how this is very persuasive for people, and teach biostatistics and the importance of maintaining it throughout life, raise awareness of the ambient conditions which can compromise decision-making, promote critical thinking. We know what the ambient conditions are. I have one more slide on that, I think. This was a paper that appeared in the Cambridge Quarterly of Healthcare Ethics, and just came out of the blue. Somebody sent me this and said, "Are you aware of this?" This is by 2 ethicists at Cornell, and I think one of them is Joseph Finns, I think, is a neurologist, and Meredith Stark is an ethicist. But essentially what they say is this: you've got a problem in medicine, right? You're killing 40,000 to 80,000 patients in hospital, never mind all those who are going through emergency medicine or family medicine. You have a major problem, number one. Number two, you know what the problem is caused by. It's caused by miscalibrated thinking. Premise 3, you know how to fix that in the sense that we have to look for all the interventions in thinking that can improve it. And there is a good literature on this, and we know what to do. And then fourthly, you don't have an option. Once you know the problem and you know how to fix it and people are dying, then you have no option. You have to do that. That is what they call an ethical imperative. So the take-home messages are: all decision-making needs work. Critical thinking interventions, I haven't got into it much here, but if you want to learn about it, go to the Dalhousie website on critical thinking. And if you want, take our course, TACT. It's an online course you do from your own home. And I wouldn't say this, except that everybody who takes it says that they thought it was worthwhile. It should be explicit. Any intervention in decision-making should be explicit. Not, you go and spend time with Joe because he's a great decision-maker, and then put in a day or two with Mary because she knows what. That stuff works to some extent, but we would prefer to see explicit activities on changing people's thinking. And as I said, it's an ethical imperative. Going back to that case at the beginning, the 12-year-old girl who comes in, has a cardiac arrest, goes through the CPR and everything else. At autopsy, she was found to have a tension pneumothorax. Now, 14-gauge angiocath into a second interspace, and that was it. It was all over. And instead, people couldn't break their thinking on this algorithmic approach. The epinephrine didn't work, try this, try this, try this. None of that worked. Go back to the beginning, start again. And they go through the ACLS again. The slavish following of kind of algorithmic thinking, instead of somebody just pulling back a bit and saying, well, a couple of things don't fit here. Do you typically get pain with asthma, chest pain? Actually, I haven't heard people complain about pain much. What else could this be in a healthy girl? And she's in basketball, she may have had a contact injury, and then suddenly she's doing something she's never done before. What else could this be? And that's the generic kind of forcing strategy. Thank you.